Alfred was Egbert's grandson and the youngest son of his father Ethelwulf. Physically infirm, he was nevertheless confirmed by the Witan as the King of Wessex in 871 at the age of 22. He started with nothing except a remarkable intellect, a particularly active version of the Anglo-Saxon fairness gene, the advantage from the age of 6 of being able to watch his 3 older brothers reigning immediately before him, and the confidence of a blessing received from the Pope in Rome on a visit at the age of 4. But Alfred's principal source of his understanding of Christianity came from the Celtic roots of Glastonbury, which stood him in very good stead for fighting the Vikings. The first recorded offensive Viking raid took place at Portland in Dorset in about 789. The Dorchester Reeve rode up to them as they landed and in the king's name asked them their business. The Reeve was left in no doubt. He was killed where he stood on the beach. The Vikings from Norway had made settlements in the Scottish islands of the Orkneys, Shetlands and Outer Hebrides during the 8th century and began to attack the British Isles in earnest in June 793 when they plundered Lindisfarne. After further attacks, the monks left the monastery, taking with them the remains of the much revered 6th and last Bishop of Lindisfarne, St. Cuthbert, eventually forming a new monastery much safer inland in Durham, where the remains of the saint can still be found today. But after laying waste Lindisfarne, the Vikings simply moved to the west coast of Scotland, to the Hebrides, where eventually they found St. Columba's monastery. The Isle of Iona is famous for its white sands, like the ones here in the bay below the monastery. And this is the view above Martyrs Bay. And here is some of the white sand of Iona. The first attack from the Vikings was in 795. A more brutal one took place in 806, leaving 86 monks dead. And again in 825, when all of the monks were murdered. On the white sands of Martyrs Bay there was no escape for the terrified, cornered monks. It is said that the sea and sand were stained blood red after that slaughter. The Vikings were also responsible for the death of England's first patron saint, St. Edmund, who was captured by the Great Heathen Army in 869. Edmund, the King of East Anglia, is said to have lost his life because he refused the demands of the invaders that he should renounce his Christianity. His courage and the manner of his death captured the public's imagination, and his remains became a shrine here at the monastery in the Suffolk town of what would soon become known as Bury St. Edmunds. Alfred would have known about the Vikings. He was born here in Wantage in 849, the 4th son of Ethelwulf, King of Wessex. And he watched his father and his 3 older brothers rule before he was made king himself in 871, just 2 years after the death of Edmund and East Anglia had been overrun. Like Offa and Egbert before him, Alfred was taught Celtic Christianity. The Saxon kingdoms were now firmly founded on Christian principles, and the people of Britain were agreed that they were far more content and fulfilled when they were governed by the Christian principles that they themselves had also been taught, than any of the attempts at foreign domination under foreign gods that they'd had to endure in the past. Christian principles, it was decided, were worth fighting for. But the Vikings had become a problem. Starting with Lindisfarne and spreading through Northumbria, the Saxons were being forced further and further south and west. And by about 875 it seemed that the whole of Great Britain might be at the mercy of these Norse invaders. The only man standing in the way of the Danish king Guthrum was Alfred, king at the age of 22, without any of the resources he needed to mount an effective opposition. After finding himself on the wrong end of more skirmishes against the Danes in the southwest, this physically infirm but intellectual giant of a man decided to find a place to hide out for a while and think things out. I'm standing at one end of the Isle of Athelney, where Alfred came and famously burnt the cakes while he was thinking through how to defeat the Danes. At the far end, there's the Alfred Monument, erected more than 100 years ago, the millennium of Alfred's death. In Alfred's day, the land surrounding this little island, less than 100 yards wide and just a few hundred yards long, would have been surrounded by water at high tide twice a day. It was an ideal place to hide amongst all the other little islands on the Somerset levels of those days. And this is the Alfred Monument. The inscription reads, King Alfred the Great, in the year of our Lord 879, having been defeated by the Danes, fled for refuge to the forest of Athelney. Here he lay concealed from his enemies for the space of a whole year. He soon after regained possession of his throne. It's here were sown the seeds of the British Navy. Alfred realized that it was far more efficient if the Danes could be prevented from landing while they were in their ships, so he ordered the construction of vessels which were appropriate for ramming and sinking the Viking longships. It was here that he thought through that a king needs men of war, men of prayer, and men of work. And he began to sort out the laws, the education, and the defense of his realm. Alfred's intellectual and military prowess was phenomenal. After just a year of preparation, he brought his army here to Bratton Camp, where Alfred fought the Danes at the Battle of Ethandune, or Eddington. The battle was decisive, and Alfred was victorious. He subsequently agreed terms with Guthrum, the king of the Danes, at what's known as the Treaty of Wedmore. But in order to make the terms stick, he required Guthrum and his followers to become Christians. Such was Alfred's faith in the strengths of those principles. Alfred went on to be the first person to translate parts of the Bible, 3 chapters of the laws in Exodus, into the English of the day, so that his subjects could read it in their own language. Having sorted out his men of war, Alfred turned his attention to making men of war into men of work in times of peace. He began the borough system of government, beginning with a string of fortified towns, each of which had a degree of autonomy of government within its own town walls. There's a phrase in the English language that's a moot point, which refers back to the local democratic processes of medieval Saxon Britain, when the community would hold a moot and discuss the best solution to a situation which needed resolving. After that discussion, everyone in the community would expect and be expected to sign up to the decision reached because they'd all had an opportunity to make their own views known and could understand that the decision reached had been agreed by everyone because it was reasonable and fair. In due course, each town would build its own moot house. This is the one in Aldborough in Suffolk. We can have a look inside. Aldborough's moot house was built a long time after Alfred, in about 1400, but it's still used for the town council meetings today, and it would have shared, in common with the moots held in Alfred's time, the visit of the reeve. It was Alfred who incorporated into government a genuinely two-way conversation between the king and his people. At the moot there would be an exchange of views between the reeve, the king's representative, and the town and village people directly themselves. As the kingdom got bigger, so the king needed to appoint local representatives of his own. And as the shires were instituted, so the shire reeve, or sheriff, became the sovereign's representative. It would take many centuries and many small steps towards democracy before the town moot and the king's reeve would become the House of Commons, and the Witena Gemmo turn into the House of Lords. But those two government institutions that we have in Britain today can trace their roots to King Alfred. More important to Alfred than his military victories or his political administration were his Christian religion and a desire to make education as widely available as possible. How tragic it is, he wrote, that the people of England must go abroad to seek learning. The university at Oxford was the first of its kind in the world. A court case in 1727 would establish that the roots of University College lie in a monastic endowment by King Alfred. But Alfred began to not appoint new bishops when the see became vacant, thereby both irritating the Pope and further establishing the integrity of the original British Celtic Church, in contrast to the one that was developing in Rome. Near the end of Alfred's reign, the Archbishop of Reims wrote, in 896, a body of nobles with swinish and brutish lusts, many of whom could not even write their own names, captured the papacy, a situation Alfred was familiar with. One small illustration of the integration and reconciliation in England under Alfred is the way in which the Norse gods came to give their names to the middle 4 days of the week in the English language. Alfred also went on to incorporate into his administration the laws written down by kings of earlier centuries, Ethelbert, Ine, and Offa. It would be impossible to do justice here to Alfred the Great's contribution to England. This is the summary on the plaque under his statue in Wantage. The last sentence seems to have a particular relevance today.